Shavua Tov Rabotai, Rabbi Kovacs, and we are continuing the Mishnah Yomi in the fourth parak of Kilayim at the sixth Mishnah. Over Shabbat, I was asked a shaila if in hutz laaretz today we can plant Kilayim in a vegetable garden, or if we continue having the harchako to the 6 tefachim between the vegetable plants and the greater distances that we're seeing right now about between the vineyard, between the vines, and other species. And the Shulchan Aruch paskins in Yoredeya Reish Tzadi Zayin that in hutz laaretz there's no issue of Kilayim, that is only in Eretz Yisrael. So the vegetable garden is certainly does not require all of these harchakot and all of the spacing that we're seeing in these Mishnah. They apply in Eretz Yisrael. However, the last halacha in the prior sif in Reish Tzadi Vav, he says that Kilayim applies rabbinically. So he says, Kol ha'shiorim ha'elu shemarchikim b'negafanim v'tfua v'yerek einam ele b'Eretz Yisrael. He says all of the spacing that we see between the grapevines and other species are only in Eretz Yisrael, or B'Suria, or in Syria. Now recall that Syria was conquered by David the Melech. We mentioned in Demai that produce from Syria is a bit more like produce of Eretz Yisrael for Meiser. Aval b'chutz laaretz, the halach continues, muter lizroa b'tzad gefanim b'toch hakerem l'chatchila. You could plant things next to the vines in hutz laaretz. Lo asur b'chutz laaretz ele lizroa shtei minei yarek tvua im chartzon b'polat yad. It says what's asur in hutz laaretz is planting seeds of a different species along with a grape seed at the same time. So planting the seeds at the same time would be asur in the same hole, but planting a vegetable or a grain next to a grapevine that's already there in hutz laaretz is not a problem. So you can even tell a child who's not Jewish to plant such a thing in hutz laaretz, but not to a godel, because you might confuse a godel with a Yisrael godel and tell somebody to actually do something that's asur. It's rabbinically asur Kilayim in hutz laaretz, and again Kilayim in hutz laaretz does not require these spacings, only in Eretz Yisrael. Good. So continuing in the fourth parak of Kilayim, Chalacha Vav, Anoteya Shtayim Keneged Shtayim. Someone had two opposite two. Achat Yotzei Zanav. Apologies, that's Vav. We're on Zayin today. Anoteya Shur Achat B'toch Shelo. He plants one row in his own space, his own property, V'shur Achat B'toch Shel Chavero, and at another row in his friend's property, hopefully at Rishos, and there's a little path, an individual's path, it's very small, or even a derech harabim in the middle. So there's a little path dividing these fields. This derech harabim is not a Rishos harabim, that would be 16 amos, it'd be very large, because derech harabim, we'll see, is less than 8 amos. V'goder, shunamach v'sar tefachim, or there's a fence in between the two properties, but it's a short fence. It's less than 10 tefachim, which is the legal height for a fence. So these combine, and you can have a vineyard, even though one row of vines is in your property and one row is planted in the neighbor's property. Mishnah continues, Gevoa misar tefachim, if the fence is higher than 10 tefachim, and a mitzarfot, they do not combine. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda qualifies this. Im ersan, if it's cradled over, like trellised over the fence, milmala, so you're bringing the vines over the fence, or so they do combine. Mishnah Chet continues, Notesh Teshurot im ein benehem shmona amot lo yivzer lasham. Now this is simply, he has maybe 2 rows of 2. It's not legally a kerem, so you can't plant, even though it's not, maybe perhaps not legally a big kerem. But if there's less than 8 amot between them, it still combines enough to become a kerem. Lo yivzer lasham. You can't bring other plants, other species in between those 2 rows. Hayu shalosh, if there's 3 rows in there, im ein bein shura lechaverta 16 amot. If they're less than 16 amot between one row and another, lo yavizer lasham. So this is obviously a bigger vineyard, and you can't bring anything in there unless you have 16 amot, like we learned in the original Mishnah in this parak, that you'd have to have 4 amot next to each row of vines, the avodat, the kerem, the workspace, and then you need a chashuv area in the middle, which would be big enough to constitute like 2 rows of another species. So you'd have to have at least 16 amot to put something else in there. Abelezer ben Yaakov Omer Mishum Chanina ben Chachinoi Afilu Harva Emsait. So even if the middle row was destroyed, they had 3 rows in this vineyard, and if the middle row is destroyed, now there's a lot more space in between the outside rows that are still there. Ein ben shul averet sheshes amma, but there are less than 16 amma between the remaining outside rows. It's still, the whole thing is considered a kerem, lo yavizer l'sham. You can't plant another seed there. She'ilu batchila netan hare ze muter b'shmone amma. Even though, if he had planted originally there, without the middle row of the grapevine ever existing, he would only need an 8 amma space. So that was the first case in Mishnah Ches. If there were 2 rows, but there's more than 8 amot in the middle, he could plant something in that space. But with 3 rows, you need 16 amot spacing in between the vines, and even if that middle row gets ripped out, and now there are 16 amas of space, Rabbi ben Yaakov adds from Rabbi Chanina ben Chachinai that since it was originally a vineyard with a tighter spacing, even though now there's a greater spacing, you still can't plant Kilayim there. And again, as we brought in the Shulchan Aruch, this would be not an issue in hutz laaretz, but definitely an issue in Eretz Yisrael. And the same with the garden. The spacing in the garden, again, would not be an issue in hutz laaretz. So we can go ahead and start our gardening. Chag kasher v'sameach, be well.